Week 18, Overview, 1848, Gold Dust and Gunpowder. This is the last week of Unit 2. We're wrapping up our study of the Age of Jackson and the era of westward expansion. There's a lot to do at the end of any unit, so let's get busy. We're going to learn about the presidency of Zachary Taylor, one of the famous generals of the Mexican-American War. His men called him Old Rough and Ready. He died before the end of his term, so even though he was elected in 1848, his tenure of office ended in 1850. Of all the issues during his presidency, the most troubling was the recurrent issue of slavery. This week we'll learn about the next chapter in this sectional conflict and about how the Compromise of 1850, which was actually signed into law after Taylor's death, created yet another uneasy truce between North and South. There were many exciting things happening in 1848, both in America and in Europe. The ink was hardly dry on the treaty which handed California to the United States when they discovered gold in them thar hills. A mad scramble for wealth ensued. While all this was going on, in a much more quiet way, the women's rights movement was getting its start. The first regional conference on women's rights was held in Seneca Falls, New York, in 1848. Meanwhile, over in Europe, 50 revolutions broke out against established authorities all over the continent. Older students will read about these revolutions, and rhetoric students will analyze the long-term effects they had on the history of Europe. Let's start with Zachary Taylor, who traced his ancestry back to the Mayflower. His military career propelled him into the spotlight. He defended Fort Harrison from Indian forces during the War of 1812. He participated in the Black Hawk War in 1832 and the Second Seminole War from 1835 to 1842. During the Seminole War, Taylor became famous at the Battle of Lake Okeechobee, where he was promoted to brigadier general and then given command of all the forces in Florida. Taylor played a major role in the Mexican-American War. President Polk sent him to patrol the Rio Grande, where he defeated the Mexican troops. His victories over Mexican General Santa Anna made him a national hero. President Polk was a Democrat, but he didn't run for re-election. Taylor was a Whig, and he was the last Whig ever to be elected president. Taylor died after only 2 years in office, but his term included one of the biggest human migrations in American history, the California Gold Rush of 1848. It began when a worker at John Sutter's sawmill in Northern California noticed small, shiny objects in one of the nearby rivers. He showed the boss what he had found, and the two men realized they were literally sitting on a gold mine. They tried to keep the gold a secret, but word spread. Hundreds of hopeful prospectors began teaming around his land in search of gold. The discovery kicked off a vast gold rush that would bring thousands of Americans and immigrants to California and would accelerate the development of the West. They called it gold fever, the frenzied scramble and mad dash for gold. Thousands of eager prospectors traveled to California from near and far, leaving behind the comforts of their homes and their families in the hope of finding wealth. All kinds of people came to California. There were U.S. citizens and immigrants from Mexico, Ireland, Germany, France, Turkey, Peru, Australia. Many of the Chinese immigrants found their gold a different way. They opened restaurants and laundries that served the miners who hit pay dirt. Businesses boomed as entrepreneurs realized they could charge whatever price they wanted for the goods that miners had to have. Much of Taylor's short 2-year term was spent trying to solve political tensions created by all the new land that Americans had acquired. Since the Missouri Compromise of 1820, the delicate balance between slave and free states had been maintained. Texas and Florida entered the Union as slave states in 1845. Texas claimed much of the Southwest Territory that had been given to the U.S. by Mexico as its own land. This territory would, if it was indeed part of Texas, become slave territory. When California requested entry as a free state, the decision became an even more important issue. The U.S. decided it would pay Texas $10 million to relinquish its claims on the Southwest territories in question. Under the set of laws collectively known as the Compromise of 1850, these territories would be allowed to choose for themselves whether they wanted to allow or abolish slavery. The Compromise also tried to appease Northerners by abolishing the slave trade, but not slavery itself, in the District of Columbia. Finally, the Compromise included a beefed-up fugitive slave law, which mandated federal aid in returning runaway slaves. Taylor's death in office prevented him from either signing or vetoing the Compromise. His vice president, Millard Fillmore, took over for the last 2 years of his term. Except for signing the Compromise of 1850 into law, there isn't all that much to say about Fillmore. He couldn't even get his own party, the Whigs, to nominate him for re-election as president when his half-term ended in 1852. He tried to run for president in 1856 as the candidate for both the Whigs and the new Know-Nothing Party. 10 days after President Taylor's death, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott gathered about 100 women for the first Women's Rights Convention. They met at Seneca Falls in New York. The women, and on the second day and afterwards, men at Seneca Falls, wrote up their own declaration. Entitled A Declaration of Sentiments, it copied the phrases and form of the Declaration of Independence. It insisted that all men and women are created equal, replaced the tyrant King George III with men in general, and then claimed that the history of mankind is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations on the part of man toward woman, having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over her. They announced their intentions to use the same methods the abolitionists had used to change people's minds: petitions, pamphlets, books, articles, sermons, and any other form of speech that might persuade Americans to recognize the equal rights of women. A commitment to the rights of women wasn't the only thing these activists had in common, however. Many of the people who met at the convention, and also many others throughout the country, were strong abolitionists. They believed that slavery was an evil institution that should be abolished. The great black leader, Frederick Douglass, attended the Seneca Falls Convention and spoke up for their cause. It was a time when radical ideas were in the air: equal rights for slaves and women and the workers of the world. Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels made that last phrase famous in 1848 with their Communist Manifesto. The manifesto outlined how and why the working class should rise up and overthrow capitalism. Marx believed in what we refer to as salvation through stuff, meaning that the ultimate questions in life can be answered by changing who owns what. Marx argued that man's misery was caused by inequality, as opposed to human sin, and promised happiness through the redistribution of wealth. The manifesto ended with the ringing cry, "Workers of the world, unite! You have nothing to lose but your chains." Marx wanted international communism, but that wasn't what prompted dozens of uprisings across Europe in 1848. The revolutions began with disturbances in the south of Italy, but it was France, as usual, that kicked things into high gear. In February 1848, French workers and intellectuals protested against corrupt politicians and a deteriorating economy. The king, Louis-Philippe, abdicated. France was tired of kings and set up a new government they called the Second Republic. There were some lasting changes. Every adult French male got the right to vote, for example, but many of the commoners knew nothing about government. The most recognizable name on the ballot was a Napoleon, Louis Napoleon, nephew of the emperor, who started out as first consul of the First Republic of France. The new Napoleon was elected president of the Second Republic, and he turned that into the Second French Empire, as we'll see in Unit 3. Students and workers in Vienna began to riot in 1848 as well. Vienna was the capital of the Austrian Empire, a collection of ethnic groups with many languages and cultures. Hungarians and Bohemians, in what is now the Czech Republic, rebelled against Austrian rule. Italians tried to drive their Austrian overlords out of northern Italy and briefly drove the Pope out of Rome. There were nationalistic revolts against Russia and Prussia as well as Austria. There are many different people groups in Eastern, Central, and Southern Europe, and they wanted to govern themselves. It was not to be, however. Though they were initially put on the defensive, within a year the big imperial powers crushed those dreams. Germany's many territories were not subject to any foreign empire, but they weren't united either. Some activists wanted to replace the loose German Confederation with a new German nation. But they weren't the only Germans rioting. Workers rose up in protest to demand reform of their working conditions. Others demanded more political rights, like freedom of speech and of the press. On the surface, all of these uprisings accomplished very little. At a deeper level, however, ideals were articulated and crystallized, and nationalist leaders learned valuable lessons and bided their time. In Unit 3, we'll see how these revolutions helped lay the foundations for Europe's future. All these revolutions make for an exciting end to a remarkable unit. Your children have seen how a young America grew in self-confidence and size. They've looked at England's expanding empire under Victoria. There have been highlights and low points in our studies, technological advances as well as industrial oppression. We've seen the dark thread of slavery appear more and more prominently in our tapestry, but we'll see how that works out next unit.